The slap echoed a second too long, and the man standing at the door had heard everything. Daniel Carter hadn't planned to come home early that afternoon. Billion-dollar meetings rarely ended ahead of schedule, and yet something, a quiet instinct he couldn't explain, had pulled him away from the glass towers of downtown and back to the estate that sat on 10 acres of manicured silence just outside the city. The Carter residence was the kind of place people whispered about, a sprawling structure of marble floors, cathedral ceilings, and walls lined with art worth more than most homes. It was supposed to feel like control, like power made visible. But today, as Daniel stepped inside, something felt off. The air was too still. The usual rhythm of polished footsteps and hushed voices had been replaced by a tension that pressed against the walls like a storm waiting to break. Then came the sound. Sharp, sudden, out of place in a home built on quiet perfection. Daniel stopped mid-step, his hand still resting on the edge of the door as it slowly closed behind him. His eyes moved forward, steady, controlled, taking in the scene unfolding in the grand living room just beyond the entry hall. A silver tea tray lay tilted on the floor, porcelain cups scattered across a Persian rug, their contents spreading in slow, uneven stains. And beside it stood Victoria Carter, perfectly dressed, posture flawless, expression cold. In front of her, frozen in place, was a small girl, Sophie Miller, 10 years old, the daughter of the housemaid. Her hands trembled at her sides, her shoulders drawn inward as if trying to disappear into the air itself. She had been told to stay invisible. She had learned to obey. But invisibility had failed her today. "Look at what you've done," Victoria said, her voice low but cutting, the kind of tone that didn't need volume to wound. "Do you have any idea what this costs?" Sophie didn't answer. She couldn't. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor, on the broken cups, as if staring hard enough might reverse what had already happened. A few steps away, her mother, Laura Miller, stood pale and silent, her hands clenched together so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She knew better than to speak. In this house, speaking out of turn came with consequences no paycheck could justify. Daniel remained where he was, unseen for just a moment longer. He watched. He listened. And what he heard next settled something deep inside him. "Maybe this will teach you to be more careful," Victoria added, brushing an invisible speck from her sleeve, her tone carrying that polished edge of superiority she wore like a second skin. It wasn't just the words. It was the certainty behind them, the belief that she was entitled to decide what others deserved. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the vast space around him. Then he stepped forward. One step, then another. The soft echo of his shoes against marble cut through the tension like a line drawn in stone. Victoria turned first. Her expression shifted instantly, from irritation to surprise, then quickly into something composed, something practiced. "Daniel," she said, a faint smile appearing as if nothing had happened, as if the moment could simply be rewritten by his presence. But Daniel didn't return the smile. His gaze moved past her, settling on Sophie. He noticed the way she stood too still, the way her fingers curled slightly, as if holding on to something invisible just to stay steady. Then he looked at Laura, whose eyes filled with a quiet panic she tried desperately to hide. Only then did he speak. "What happened here?" His voice was calm, controlled, the kind of calm that didn't invite interruption. Victoria gave a small, dismissive shrug. She dropped the tea, ruined the rug. I was correcting her. Correcting. The word lingered in the air, heavy in a way that couldn't be ignored. Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the statement, but his eyes didn't leave Sophie. For a brief second, something flickered there, something softer, something human beneath the polished surface of power. And then it was gone, replaced by something far more decisive. He stepped fully into the room now, the distance between them closing with deliberate precision. The house, the staff, even the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Because in that moment, everyone felt it. Something had shifted, and whatever came next would change everything. Daniel did not raise his voice, and that was what made the room feel even colder. He walked past Victoria without looking at her again, his attention fixed entirely on the small figure standing near the ruined tray. Each step was measured, deliberate, as if he were moving through something far more serious than a simple accident. When he stopped, he did not stand over Sophie. He lowered himself, slowly, carefully, until he was at her eye level. It was a small gesture, but in a house where power was usually measured in distance, it meant everything. Sophie hesitated before looking up. Her eyes were wide, uncertain, as if she were trying to understand whether this moment would bring more trouble or something she had never experienced before. Daniel studied her face, not with judgment, but with quiet attention. He noticed the way she held her breath, the way her shoulders stayed tense even when nothing was happening. This was not just fear. This was habit. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently. The question seemed to surprise her more than anything else in the room. She blinked, as if searching for the right answer, then shook her head quickly. "No, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging her answer, but he did not immediately stand. Instead, his gaze shifted slightly toward the scattered cups, then back to her. "Accidents happen," he said, his tone steady, almost calm enough to soften the air around them, especially when someone is trying to help. Behind him, Victoria let out a quiet, incredulous breath. "Daniel, you cannot be serious," she said, her composure beginning to crack at the edges. "That rug was imported. Do you know how long it took to?" "Victoria." He did not turn around when he said her name, but the way he spoke it stopped her instantly. It was not loud. It was final. "Look toward Laura. Take your daughter upstairs," he said. "There is a guest room on the east wing. You will stay there for now." Laura hesitated, her eyes darting between Daniel and Victoria, uncertainty pulling at every instinct she had learned in this house. "Sir, I do not want to cause any trouble," she said softly. Daniel met her gaze, calm but unwavering. "You are not the one causing trouble," he replied. That was all it took. Laura nodded quickly, her composure breaking just enough to reveal the relief she had been holding back. She stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Sophie's shoulder. Not more dramatic, just clearer than the moment that followed. Not exaggerated, not misunderstood, just clear. "Daniel, you are not seriously bringing business into this," she said. "This is our home." He met her gaze without hesitation. "Exactly," he replied. "And if those values do not exist here, then they do not exist anywhere." The realization hit her then, not all at once, but in pieces, each one heavier than the last. This was not an argument. This was not a passing moment. This was something permanent. And for the first time since the beginning of it all, Victoria had no strategy left, no response sharp enough to regain what she had already lost. Victoria's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. The confidence that once defined her now lingered only in fragments, barely holding together under the weight of what she was beginning to understand. Daniel did not rush the moment. He allowed the silence to do what it needed to do, to settle, to press in, to force clarity where denial had once lived. He closed the notebook slowly, the soft snap of leather echoing louder than it should have in the vast room. Then he placed it back into his coat with deliberate care, as if the act itself marked a line that could not be crossed again. "There is a board meeting tonight," he said calmly, his tone returning to something almost routine, almost ordinary, which made the words feel even heavier. "I moved it up an hour ago." Victoria blinked, confusion flashing across her face. "You moved a board meeting because of this?" she asked, her voice rising slightly despite her attempt to remain composed. Daniel looked at her, not with anger, but with something far more final. "No," he said. "I moved it because I needed to be certain." She took a step closer, searching his face, looking for any sign of hesitation, any indication that this could still be undone. "Daniel, this is ridiculous," she insisted. "You are letting a single moment define everything." He tilted his head slightly, considering her words as if they deserved a fair evaluation. "A single moment does not define everything," he replied, "but it reveals everything." The statement settled with quiet authority. Victoria's shoulders stiffened, her posture tightening as if she were bracing herself against something she could not yet see but already feared. "You are overthinking this," she said, more firmly now, trying to regain ground. "People make mistakes. That is part of running a household, part of maintaining order." Daniel walked past her again, this time toward the tall windows that overlooked the grounds. The late afternoon light stretched across the marble floor, long shadows forming lines that seemed to divide the room into something new, something unfamiliar. He rested his hands lightly behind his back, his gaze fixed on the distance for a moment before speaking again. Order without respect is not order, he said. It is control. And control built on fear does not last. Victoria turned sharply, frustration breaking through her carefully maintained composure. So what do you want me to say? She demanded. That I am sorry? That I regret it? Fine. I regret it. Is that enough? Daniel did not turn around immediately. He let her words hang in the air, unchallenged, unacknowledged for a moment longer than she expected. When he finally faced her again, his expression had not softened. No, he said simply. Because this is not about what you say now. It is about what you showed when you thought no one was watching. The words landed harder than any raised voice ever could. Victoria's breath caught, her eyes narrowing slightly as the realization deepened. This was not a conversation she could redirect. This was not a situation she could recover from with the right tone or the right apology. This was something else entirely. Something irreversible. Daniel walked back toward the center of the room, stopping at the exact place where the broken tea set had been only minutes ago. The rug had already been partially cleaned, the evidence of the accident fading, but the moment itself remained, etched into the space in a way no cleaning could erase. You asked what happens next, he said, his voice steady, unwavering. Now you will see. Victoria's heartbeat seemed to echo in her ears, loud and uneven, though the room itself remained silent. Daniel, she said, more quietly now, a trace of something unfamiliar entering her voice. Think about what you are doing. He met her gaze, and for the first time since the moment began, there was something deeply personal in his eyes. Not anger, not disappointment, something closer to resolve. I have, he replied. Then, without another word, he reached for his phone and made a single call. He did not step away. He did not lower his voice. This is Daniel Carter, he said clearly. I need everyone present within the hour. Yes, tonight. No exceptions. A pause. And bring the documents. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Victoria stood frozen, the full weight of what was unfolding settling in with undeniable clarity. This was no longer about a private moment inside a closed home. This was about to become something public, something official, something that would not disappear. And as the quiet stretched once more between them, she realized something she had never considered before. Power did not belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belonged to the one who decided what happened next. And in this moment, that was no longer her. The house began to change before anyone said another word. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a shift in air pressure before a storm. Staff members who had remained out of sight now moved quietly through the hallways, their footsteps softer than usual, their voices reduced to whispers that barely carried. News traveled fast in a house like this, not through announcements, but through instinct. Something was happening, something that would not be undone. Victoria remained where she was, but the stillness around her no longer felt like control. It felt like isolation, the kind that comes when the ground beneath you begins to move and no one reaches out to steady it. She watched Daniel as he moved through the room with quiet precision, adjusting nothing, fixing nothing, as if the disorder around him no longer mattered. That, more than anything, unsettled her. You are really doing this, she said finally, her voice lower now, stripped of its earlier sharpness. Daniel did not answer immediately. He walked toward the fireplace, resting one hand lightly on the mantel, his posture relaxed but intentional. I already have, he said after a moment. The words landed with quiet certainty. Victoria took a slow breath, steadying herself. You think this will make you look noble, she said, her tone shifting again, searching for leverage. You think people will admire this? Daniel turned his head slightly, not fully facing her, but enough to acknowledge the statement. This is not about being admired, he replied. It is about being accountable. The distinction was clear, and it left no room for negotiation. A car door closed outside. Then another. The distant sound of engines settling into silence followed, heavy and deliberate. Victoria's eyes flicked toward the tall windows, her expression tightening as reality began to catch up with her. You called them here, she said, almost to herself. Yes, Daniel answered. I did. The front doors opened moments later, the sound echoing through the entry hall with a quiet authority that matched the tone of everything else unfolding. Footsteps followed, measured, professional, not hurried, but purposeful. The board had arrived. 3 men and 1 woman entered the space, each dressed in understated elegance, each carrying the kind of presence that came from years of making decisions that affected more than just themselves. They paused briefly as they took in the room, the atmosphere, the tension that lingered like something unfinished. "Daniel," one of them said, a man in his 60s with a calm, observant expression. "You said this could not wait." Daniel nodded once. "It cannot," he replied. Victoria stepped forward then, her composure snapping back into place with visible effort. "I am glad you are all here," she said, her voice regaining a polished edge. "There seems to be some misunderstanding that has been blown out of proportion." The woman on the board glanced at her briefly, then back at Daniel, as if already sensing where the truth would come from. Daniel did not interrupt Victoria. He allowed her to finish, allowed her to present whatever version of the moment she believed could still protect her. And when she stopped speaking, when the silence returned once more, he stepped forward. "There is no misunderstanding," he said calmly. "Only a decision that needs to be made." He gestured slightly toward the seating area, inviting them to sit, but he did not take a seat himself. He remained standing, centered, grounded, as if what he was about to say required that kind of presence. The board members exchanged brief glances before settling into place, their attention fully on him now. Victoria remained standing as well, but something had shifted. She was no longer the one directing the room. She was part of it, and for the first time, she felt what that meant. Daniel reached into his coat once more, retrieving a thin folder this time. He held it for a moment, not opening it yet, letting the weight of what it represented settle into the space around them. "What we decide tonight," he said, his voice steady, "will define what this house stands for moving forward." No one spoke. No one needed to, because everyone in that room understood that this was no longer about a moment. It was about a standard, and whether it would be upheld. Daniel opened the folder slowly, not with hesitation, but with intention, as if every second mattered. Inside were a few pages, clean, precise, each one representing decisions that had already been thought through long before this moment arrived. He placed the folder on the table in front of the board members, turning it so they could read it clearly. No dramatics, no raised voice, just facts. "You will find the relevant documentation there," he said calmly. Effective immediately, the older man at the table adjusted his glasses and began to scan the first page. The others followed, their expressions shifting gradually from neutral attention to quiet understanding. No one spoke at first. The silence stretched, but it was no longer uncertain. It was evaluative. Victoria stood just behind them, her eyes moving quickly between their faces, searching for any sign that someone would challenge this, that someone would question the speed, the severity, the finality of what Daniel had initiated. "This is excessive," she said finally, her voice controlled but strained. "You cannot make structural decisions based on one isolated incident." The woman on the board looked up. First, her expression calm but firm. "This is not about an incident," she said. "It is about alignment with the values these foundations claim to represent." Her tone was not accusatory. It was factual, and that made it harder to dismiss. Victoria turned toward her, frustration rising again. "Values are easy to speak about in theory," she replied. "But running a household, managing people, maintaining standards, that requires discipline." Daniel did not interrupt. He let the exchange unfold, knowing that the truth did not need force to stand on its own. The older man closed the folder gently, placing his hands on top of it, as if sealing the conclusion. "Discipline without dignity is not leadership," he said quietly. "It is control. And control, when exposed, damages everything it touches." The words settled with weight, not just in the room, but in the space between what had been and what would follow. Victoria's posture faltered for a fraction of a second, just enough to reveal that the certainty she once carried was no longer intact. "So that is it?" she asked, her voice lower now, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "You all just agree with this?" The board members exchanged brief glances, not to decide, but to confirm what was already clear. The woman spoke again. "We are not here to agree or disagree emotionally," she said. "We are here to uphold standards that were defined long before today." Daniel stepped forward slightly, his presence steady, grounded, as if anchoring the moment. "And those standards begin here," he added. "Not in public statements. Not in charity events. Here." Victoria looked at him then, really looked at him. as if trying to find the version of him she had always known, the one who moved through decisions with calculated detachment, the one who prioritized outcomes over moments. But that version was no longer standing in front of her. This one was different. Not louder, not harsher, just clearer. "You are choosing them over me," she said, her voice almost a whisper now. Daniel held her gaze, not unkindly, but without hesitation. "I am choosing what is right," he replied. "And if that feels like a choice against you, then you already know why." No one moved. No one spoke. The board members remained seated, composed, waiting only for the final step to be acknowledged. Daniel closed the folder, not to end the discussion, but to confirm it. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice steady. "Victoria Carter is removed from all positions associated with these foundations." The words were simple, but they carried finality. Victoria did not respond right away. She stood there, absorbing the shift, the quiet unraveling of everything she had believed was secure. And in that moment, the room did not feel like a place of power anymore. It felt like a place of truth. And truth, once spoken, does not return to silence. Victoria did not move for several seconds after the decision was spoken, as if her body had not yet caught up with the reality of what had just happened. The room remained still, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer tense. It was settled. Final. She let out a slow breath, one that carried something unfamiliar, something close to disbelief. "You cannot just erase me like this," she said quietly, her voice no longer sharp, no longer controlled in the way it had been before. Daniel did not respond immediately. He allowed her words to exist in the space, not dismissing them, but not validating them either. The board members remained seated, composed, their role complete, their presence now simply witness to what followed. Victoria took a step forward, her posture less rigid now, more human, more uncertain. "Everything I have built, everything I have done for these foundations," she continued, her voice gaining slight strength. "You are going to pretend none of it matters?" Daniel met her gaze, calm as ever, but there was something deeper in his expression now, something that acknowledged the weight of her question without changing the answer. "It matters," he said, "but it does not outweigh what was revealed today." The words did not strike like a blow. They settled, heavy and unavoidable. Victoria shook her head slowly, as if trying to reject the conclusion itself. "So one moment defines me," she said. "That is what you were saying." Daniel stepped closer, not confrontational, but deliberate, making sure there was no distance left for misunderstanding. "No," he said quietly. "It does not define you. It exposes you." The distinction lingered between them, impossible to ignore. Victoria's eyes shifted, searching for something, anything, that could restore balance, restore control, restore the version of reality she had always relied on. But nothing came. For the first time, she stood in a space where influence did not follow her, where presence did not command the room, where status did not protect her from consequence. She looked around, briefly, at the board members, at the walls, at the space she had once moved through with absolute certainty. And then she understood. Not all at once, but enough. "And what happens now?" she asked, her voice quieter, steadier, but stripped of illusion. Daniel did not hesitate. "Now we move forward," he said. With clarity, he turned slightly toward the board. "The transition documents will be finalized tonight. Public statements will be prepared in the morning. No ambiguity." The older man nodded once. Understood. There was no resistance. No debate. Only agreement with what had already been decided. Victoria closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if trying to gather something that had already slipped beyond reach. When she opened them again, the fight that had defined her earlier was gone. In its place was something quieter. Not acceptance. Not yet. But awareness. She looked at Daniel one last time, searching his face for something familiar, something that might soften the outcome. But what she saw instead was something far more unyielding. Not cold. Not distant. Just resolved. "You have changed," she said softly. Daniel considered that for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "No," he replied. "I stopped ignoring what was always there." The answer carried a quiet truth that did not need explanation. Victoria exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly, as if the weight she carried had finally found its place. She did not argue again. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, no longer the center of the room, no longer the force that shaped it. And in that stillness, something else became clear. The power she had always believed was hers had never truly been about control. It had been about trust. And once broken, it did not return. Not with words. Not with position. Not with time. The room remained silent as the moment closed. Not with noise. Not with conflict. But with something far more permanent. A shift. One that could not be undone. One that would be remembered long after the echoes of this day had faded. The meeting did not end with a bang or a raised voice. It ended with quiet movement, chairs sliding back, documents being gathered, decisions already sealed before anyone stood up. The board members rose one by one, each offering Daniel a brief nod, not of celebration, but of acknowledgement. This was not victory. This was alignment. Within minutes, they were gone, their footsteps fading down the long hallway until the house returned to its stillness once more. But it was not the same stillness as before. This one carried clarity. Daniel remained standing for a moment after the doors closed, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, as if allowing the weight of what had just happened to settle into place. Then, without hesitation, he turned and walked toward the staircase. He did not look back. He did not check if Victoria followed, because for the first time, he was not concerned with how she would respond. Upstairs, the atmosphere was different. Softer, quieter. The tension that had filled the main floor had not reached here in the same way. A small lamp cast a warm glow across the guest room, where Laura sat beside her daughter, speaking in low, reassuring tones. Sophie had calmed, but her eyes still carried questions, the kind that children do not always know how to ask. When the knock came at the door, both of them turned instantly, their bodies stiffening out of instinct. "It is me," Daniel said from the other side, his voice steady, controlled, but gentler than before. Laura hesitated for only a second before standing and opening the door. When she saw him, she stepped aside immediately, her posture respectful, cautious. "Sir," she said quietly. Daniel gave a small nod as he entered, his presence filling the room in a way that was different from downstairs. Here, it was not authority that defined him. It was intention. He looked at Sophie first. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, her posture still careful, still unsure of what was expected of her. He did not approach too quickly. He did not stand over her. Instead, he pulled a nearby chair closer and sat down, bringing himself level with her again. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. Sophie looked at her mother briefly, then back at him. "I am okay," she said softly. Daniel studied her for a moment, not doubting her words, but understanding what they did not fully say. "I believe you," he replied. "But being okay does not mean nothing happened." The room grew quieter, if that was even possible. Laura lowered her gaze, her hands clasped together tightly, as if holding back everything she had not allowed herself to say. Daniel shifted his attention to her next. "You have worked here for 3 years," he said, "without a single complaint on record." Laura nodded, unsure where this was leading. "Yes, sir." He paused briefly, choosing his next words with care. "That changes nothing about today," he continued, "but it changes what comes next." Laura looked up, confusion and concern mixing in her expression. "Sir." Daniel turned back to Sophie, his tone softening just slightly. "You should never feel like you have to disappear to be safe," he said. "Not here. Not anywhere." Sophie's eyes widened just a little, not fully understanding, but sensing the meaning behind the words. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small card, placing it gently on the table beside her. "This is for a school program," he explained. "A place where you can learn, grow, and be seen for who you are." Laura's breath caught slightly. "Sir, that is not necessary," she said quickly, her voice filled with hesitation. Daniel shook his head once. "It is not charity," he said. "It is opportunity." The distinction mattered, and they both felt it. He stood slowly, not rushing the moment, not turning it into something larger than it needed to be. "You will not be returning to work tomorrow," he added, looking at Laura. Her eyes widened in alarm. "Sir, you will be transitioning to a different role," he continued calmly. "One that does not require you to stand in silence when something is wrong." Laura said nothing. She could not. Because for the first time since she had entered that house years ago, someone had seen not just her work, but her position, her reality, and had decided to change it. Daniel moved toward the door, pausing just long enough to look back at Sophie one last time. "You did nothing wrong," he said. Remember that. Then he left, closing the door softly behind him. And in that quiet room, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. Because for the first time, Sophie did not feel invisible. Morning arrived without announcement, without ceremony, just a quiet shift in light that moved slowly across the marble floors and up the walls of a house that no longer felt the same. The Carter residence still stood as it always had, expansive, polished, untouched on the surface, but something fundamental had changed beneath it. The kind of change that could not be seen, only felt. Downstairs, the staff moved differently. Not faster, not slower, but lighter, as if something unspoken had been lifted from the air. Conversations, once careful and guarded, now carried a softness that had never quite existed before. Respect, no longer enforced, had begun to take root on its own. Daniel stood by the window in his study, a cup of untouched coffee resting beside him. The city skyline stretched in the distance, steady and predictable, unlike the shift that had taken place within his own home. He had already read the morning briefings, signed the necessary documents, and approved the public statement that would be released within the hour. The words were simple, measured, clear. Leadership requires accountability. Values must exist where they are claimed. There would be questions, speculation, headlines. But none of that concerned him now, because for the first time in a long time, the message matched the truth. Upstairs, Sophie stood near the window of the guest room, holding the small card Daniel had given her. She had read the name on it more than once, tracing the letters slowly as if trying to understand what it meant for someone like her. Opportunity was not a word she had grown up with. It was something distant, something that belonged to other people. But now, it sat in her hands, real, tangible, waiting. Laura watched her quietly from across the room, her expression softer than it had been in years. Not because everything had been solved, but because something had finally been acknowledged. The silence she had lived in for so long had been broken, not by noise, but by someone choosing to see it. And that changed everything. In another part of the house, a suitcase stood near the door of what had once been Victoria's private wing. It was not large, not dramatic, just enough to carry what remained necessary. She stood beside it, still, composed, but no longer untouched by what had happened. The reflection in the mirror across from her did not show the same certainty it once had. But it showed something else, something quieter. Awareness, not immediate transformation, not redemption, but the beginning of understanding. And sometimes, that is where change begins. Back in the study, Daniel finally reached for his coffee, taking a slow sip as he looked out over the grounds. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long, steady light across everything it touched. Nothing hidden, nothing softened, just clear. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. Because this had never been about winning. It had been about choosing. Choosing what kind of man he would be. Choosing what kind of home this would remain. Choosing what would be tolerated and what would not. And in the quiet that followed, that choice spoke louder than anything else ever could. Because in the end, power is not proven by how high you stand above others. It is revealed by how firmly you stand when it matters. And dignity, once defended, has a way of changing not just a moment, but everything that comes after.